Adulthood is not a sudden acquisition of freedom. It is a forced, unconsented neurobiological adaptation. Your brain is undergoing a severe biochemical withdrawal caused by emotional abandonment. But here is the brutal physical reality. Your central nervous system detected absolute isolation. It calculated with terrifying clarity that no one was coming to save you. To prevent systemic collapse, the brain initiates an emergency compensation. It forces the construction of a synthetic parent inside your skull. This is a baseline physiological defense mechanism for survival. You are forced to commandeer the safety valves previously held by an external caregiver. This is not growth. This is a physical mutation of neural circuits under extreme deficit. Watch closely how they react. An individual approaching 30 just received a major workplace promotion. They return alone to their apartment and deadbolt the front door. They pull out their smartphone, muscle memory opening the contacts list. Their respiratory rate instantly drops, the expansion of their chest cavity sharply restricted. Their Adam's apple rolls involuntarily, producing an audible swallow. Microspasms occur in the muscles around their knuckles, and the thumb rapidly pulls away. They lock the screen and place the phone face down hard on the kitchen counter. The deltoid muscles lose all tension, physically slumping downward. They exhale heavily into a completely silent room devoid of any other respiration. Their pupils lose focus, locking dead onto an unwashed coffee mug in the sink. Their gaze remains cemented for a full 10 seconds, with zero ocular movement. The actual fatal mechanism is this severe physiological dislocation. You are actively establishing your emotional sovereignty and stepping into absolute independence. Yet, under the real-time monitoring of your central nervous system, this experience is brutal. Why does this cognitive awakening trigger physical pain, identical to severe trauma? Why are its physiological markers indistinguishable from devastating bereavement? Becoming your own parent is never a philosophical realization. It is a severe neurochemical withdrawal. Its physical origin is the total failure or absence of an external primary attachment figure. According to the cold logic of attachment theory, the human brain is hardwired to locate a secure base. When this base presents an emotional blind spot, even if that physical entity sits directly in front of you, the amygdala immediately flags the anomaly. It does not process this indifference as mere sadness. It triggers the highest biological alarm. This equals an existential survival crisis at the neurological level. Your brain calculates you could die from resource deprivation at any second. The autonomic nervous system is forced to commandeer defenses meant for a social network. You are thrown into a primal hunting ground without a buffer. And it gets worse. The hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis completely dysregulates. This HPA axis relies entirely on external safety cues to modulate pressure. Without a parental entity to provide external co-regulation, even the most microscopic daily friction triggers unfiltered cortisol secretion. Adrenaline is pumped uncontrollably into your bloodstream. Your sympathetic nervous system is permanently jammed in the on position. Your heart is forced to maintain a high-load standby frequency. Muscle fibers remain taut, preparing for a fatal physical attack that does not exist. The nervous system enters a state of chronic, unstoppable hyperarousal. What actually drains your vitality is the cognitive dissonance in object relations. Your prefrontal cortex is executing a desperate calculation. It attempts to forcefully stitch together the physical presence of a caregiver with their absolute emotional void. This irreconcilable logical conflict triggers frantic neuronal firing. Every attempt to rationalize this emotional abandonment burns massive amounts of blood glucose. Glucose is entirely depleted in an invisible internal tug of war. This computational overdraft leads directly to severe cognitive fatigue. You do nothing all day, yet feel physically drained of bone marrow. This is not laziness. This is the prefrontal cortex, overheating and shutting down from processing overload. Observe the clinical manifestation of this withdrawal in physical reality. At 2 a.m, a 30-year-old is awakened by a minor physical sting in their chest. They instantly snap their upper torso completely upright without any buffering movement. They immediately pull both knees hard against their chest. The spine curves completely, adopting a tight, defensive fetal posture. A heart rate monitor would show tachycardia spiking within a single second. They grab their phone and open the family chat interface. Their gaze locks dead onto the last seen timestamp of a parent. Their rigid fingers type out 3 words, "I feel sick." Exactly half a second later, they frantically strike the backspace key. Every character is instantly purged, leaving 0 trace of transmission. Their jaw completely locks, the masseter muscles trembling slightly from extreme tension. Respiration is strictly confined to the nasal cavity, cutting off all vocalization. They open a browser in the absolute dead silence of the room. They compulsively scroll through medical symptom databases until 4 in the morning. This forced auto-suppression yields devastating physical consequences. The parasympathetic nervous system's natural self-soothing capacity is completely paralyzed. This triggers systemic exhaustion and severe circadian rhythm deprivation. Your baseline perception of safety is completely eroded and pulverized. This extreme physical overdraft is merely a prelude. When the external sanctuary collapses, the brain resorts to extreme measures to maintain baseline survival. It violently manufactures a substitute, and this first-generation parent synthesized in your skull is almost without exception deeply hostile. Before you learn to apply gentle physiological soothing to yourself, your central nervous system involuntarily downloads historical caregiving models. Those transactional, utilitarian, or severely flawed interaction patterns are burned straight into your brain. Your internal dialogue undergoes a forced reset. It mutates into a constant, blind spot, free extreme surveillance system. The actual fatal mechanism is this psychological introjection process. To maintain an incredibly fragile, synthetic sense of control, your psychic structure rapidly absorbs the criticisms and demands of early caregivers. The subconscious logic executes a brutal physical directive. If I can demand absolute perfection from myself before the external world punishes me, I can trade this extreme self-exploitation for a chance at not being abandoned. This pathological internalization is not a choice. It is a forced compromise at the neuronal level. You code the personality traits of your abusers directly into your own neural synapses. Your brain uses absolute self-punishment to construct a distorted sense of safety. But here is the brutal physical reality. The brain's default mode network gets completely hijacked. When your body enters a state of physical rest, the neural circuits responsible for negative rumination violently seize computational power. The anterior cingulate cortex is supposed to handle routine error detection. Now, it enters a state of absolute pathological hyperarousal. It flags any minor inefficiency or physical mistake in daily life. It instantly escalates and marks it as a catastrophic survival crisis. Your alarm system completely loses its normal threshold. The neural signal of a dropped cup equates exactly to an impending death sentence. Your brain simulates the most extreme survival bottlenecks every single second. And it gets worse. The brain's reward circuitry executes an incredibly harsh withholding protocol. It was incorrectly trained to require external validation before releasing dopamine. Once external affirmation signals vanish, the entire dopamine secretion system shuts down. The central nervous system artificially induces anhedonia. You lose the physical capacity to perceive any positive emotion. This is an active biological defense strategy that cuts off the power source. The brain uses extreme biochemical means to prevent you from any trial and error, because in its exact calculations, any slight risk could trigger further social isolation. Watch closely how they react. They stand alone at the kitchen stove preparing a simple dinner. A stainless steel spoon slips from their fingers, hitting the floor with a sharp, physical clatter. The instant the sound wave hits their eardrum, their shoulders violently hike toward their ears, neck muscles locking tight. Facial muscles rapidly contract, forming a rigid, agonizing physical grimace. They directly vocalize a clear verbal attack against themselves. You are so unbelievably stupid. They do not bend to retrieve the spoon from the floor. They reach out and manually turn off the physical dial of the stove. They mechanically exit the kitchen, walk to the bedroom, and slump onto the edge of the bed. The vagal reflex is triggered instantly. Their physical energy and heart rate suffer a cliff drop, decline, within 2 seconds. Gastric acid secretion halts, and appetite is physiologically obliterated. This results in absolute clinical emotional paralysis. Self-sabotage here is absolutely not a correctable psychological flaw. It is an active, highly aggressive biological defense mechanism. It uses preemptive self-destruction to shield against the rejection the brain expects is inevitably coming. Your neurons are running a severely corrupted, inherited survival code. To overwrite this fatal programming, you must execute a highly uncomfortable, manual physical override on the brain's solidified neural pathways. Healing is never a passive emotional reconciliation. It is a highly mechanical, self-directed neuroplastic modification. You must execute violent, physical intervention. You forcefully reset the brain's distress tolerance protocols. But here is the brutal physical reality. You must fight for control of your blood flow by forcefully overriding the default intracranial dialogue. You pump blood directly back into the ventromedial prefrontal cortex. This is the advanced braking system of the human central nervous system. Once activated, it issues direct physical commands. It violently suppresses the irrational death, fear signals transmitting from the amygdala. The actual fatal mechanism is the deactivation of the vagus nerve. You must force a hard reboot through physical vocalization. You provide auditory feedback using deliberately controlled, steady, vocal cord vibration. This auditory stimulus travels along cranial nerves to directly increase vagal tone. It forcefully commandeers the autonomic nervous system on a physical level. It strictly terminates the sympathetic fight or flight mode. It hard shifts into the parasympathetic rest and digest state. This is brutal Pavlovian extinction learning. You must forcibly implant a new physical response the exact millisecond a pain trigger occurs. The old traumatic synapses are never erased, but the new neural pathways form an absolutely dominant memory trace. They structurally and comprehensively suppress the old pathological circuits. Observe the clinical execution of this forced overwrite. They sit at their workstation and receive a highly critical email from a superior. The instant their eyes scan the negative vocabulary, the muscle groups surrounding their chest cavity physically contract. Respiratory rate spikes and gas exchange becomes extremely shallow. They physically remove both hands from the keyboard, instantly, halting all input. They raise their right hand and press the palm flat against the dead center of their sternum. They apply a firm, vertical, downward physical pressure into the chest cavity. They manually commandeer their respiratory rhythm. Inhaling through the nose, the brain precisely counts backward from 4. Exhaling through the mouth, the airflow is forcibly stretched to 6 seconds. The vocal cords vibrate, producing an absolutely clear physical sound in the room. I am safe. This is a solvable work issue, not a threat to my life. Seconds after the sound enters the auditory center via bone and air conduction, the extreme tension in their masseter muscles visibly slackens. Both shoulders drop half an inch as the sympathetic nervous system loses its false grip. The peaks on the heart rate monitor begin a steady decay. This mechanical operation delivers an overwhelming victory. You systematically dismantle the inherited trauma response mechanism. You construct an impenetrable, self-generating neural homeostasis system inside your skull. And it gets worse. The stabilization of biological markers is absolutely not the endgame. Once you completely stop the invisible internal hemorrhaging of the nervous system, the underlying logic of how you interact with the human species mutates fundamentally. When this physical mechanism of self-parenting is fully installed, the underlying logic of how you connect with humans fundamentally mutates. It is no longer a desperate resource extraction based on survival instincts. It becomes a sovereign exchange between autonomous adults. But here is the brutal physical reality. The passive tethering of mirroring neurons is completely severed. You no longer rely on the emotional fluctuations of others to forcefully regulate your own endocrine system. You achieve clinical differentiation of self. regardless of the violent physical noise erupting in the external social environment. Your central nervous system, dead, locks its own physiological baseline. Human relationships are violently evicted from your survival pyramid. They are forcefully stripped of their physical function as safety life rafts. Social behaviors are completely eradicated from your baseline survival defense mechanisms. They are relocated to the higher order zone of self-actualization, serving purely as companionship. The actual fatal mechanism is oxytocin independence. You completely cease begging for transactional oxytocin stimulation through codependent bonds. Your brain no longer sustains a pathological biochemical addiction to cheap emotional soothing. It is replaced by the steady physical release of endogenous serotonin. This continuous stream of chemicals is generated entirely by your own locus of control. Your nervous system has verified its own absolute internal reliability. Watch closely how they react to sudden variables. A partner texts to cancel a highly anticipated weekend trip at the last minute. The reason provided is an extremely minor daily inconvenience. They open the screen, their gaze scanning the text data. Facial muscles exhibit a micro-expression fluctuation lasting mere fractions of a second. The orbicularis oculi muscle contracts slightly, then, instantly, restores physical smoothness. The true anomaly lies in their core vital signs. Their respiratory rhythm shows 0 millisecond level disruption. Their core body temperature does not experience the physical drop associated with panic. The waveform of their cardiac cycle remains as flat as dead water. They type calmly on the keyboard. Understood, we will reschedule. They plug the phone directly into a physical charging cable across the room. They turn to the bookshelf and mechanically extract a physical book. Pupils rapidly focus, entering a state of absolute unbroken, deep reading. This declares the absolute physical death of codependency. The biological magnetic field you emit undergoes a fundamental frequency inversion. You no longer attract broken entities, requiring repair. You will absolutely never again tolerate any cheap relationship that requires you to remain shattered to function. Never harbor any sentimental illusions about this neurobiological reconstruction. You are absolutely not doing this work to retrieve your lost childhood. That neotenous entity has suffered physical death in a neurological sense. You must forcibly cut off all neural rumination about that unlived parallel timeline. Becoming your own parent is never an emotional healing. It is an extremely cold, precisely calculated evolutionary leap. You violently rip out the foundational survival wiring inherited from your maternal source. You replace it with an impenetrable, absolutely sovereign neural architecture. In this new system, you simultaneously function as the system architect, the security hub, and the sole king. But here is the brutal physical reality. You can never entirely eradicate the sensation of isolation from your nerve endings, but your psychic entity gains an absolute, untouchable, hard physical defense. Starting right now, completely cease all invalid neural computations with your cranial void. Tomorrow morning, the exact microsecond your optic nerve registers the first ray of light, you must immediately force start your baseline survival protocols. Select 3 absolutely non-negotiable concrete actions in physical reality. For example, immediately pouring 500 milliliters of room temperature water into your stomach upon waking, standing physically under unobstructed direct sunlight for exactly 600 seconds, and absolutely severing all visual stimulation from electronic screens for the first conscious hour. You must execute these actions as mechanically as an inorganic machine. Sever all emotional input channels during execution. Disregard whatever biochemical signals of severe depression, anxiety, or extreme fatigue your amygdala is releasing. You execute these biochemical directives absolutely not to feel better. You use this extremely violent, irrefutable physical evidence to forcibly present documentation to your central nervous system. You force it to see clearly and without error. A highly competent adult with 0 margin for compromise has finally seized absolute supreme control of this physical vessel. If this video entirely pulverized the comforting physiological illusions you use to evade adulthood, hit subscribe. We absolutely do not dispense toxic biochemical placebos here. We only dissect physical reality. See you in the next one.